Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this MarketingKind exchange, in which we'll explore how we can build a new economy with our special guest, Jo Swinson, CBE. This is a really important conversation for us at MarketingKind. We've had the opportunity to speak with some of the most inspiring guests we could imagine on the need to transition to a more regenerative economics with more purposeful organizations that put greater levels of well-being at their core. And yet, for all the reason, evidence, and persuasiveness of their arguments, these approaches still appear to be the alternative rather than the mainstream, in a world which, if anything, seems to be moving further away from a positive sum mindset in which we all succeed together, towards an ever more zero-sum mindset, which sees us only succeeding at each other's expense. Now, some of that could be about to change. Former MarketingKind exchange guest Andy Burnham, for example, has recently argued that he would like to reverse much of the past 40 years of neoliberalism and foster a growth that is good for people and for places. And he may very well shortly have the opportunity to do so. Many would say that it's that 40 years that have given individualism, profit maximization, and an extractive approach to economics such seemingly firm foundations that they almost appear inevitable. But is that the right diagnosis? What change should we be aiming for? And how could we finally mobilize to make the new economy just the economy? Well, we could hardly be in better company to find out, because Jo has a long track record of putting well-being, empowerment, and inclusion at the heart of public thinking, and is now working on approaches to funding new economic activity and fostering a panoramic perspective on the new economy as it emerges across the UK and Europe. Since 2020, Jo has been the director of the grant-making foundation, Partners for a New Economy. Before that, of course, she was the youngest ever and first female leader of the Liberal Democrats. She's been a government minister for business and women and equalities. And before that, had already established a cross-party working group of MPs to work collaboratively on the new economy and well-being economics. And of potential interest to people in this particular group, before becoming an MP, Jo had worked in marketing and PR, including for Viking FM. She is the author of Equal Power and How You Can Make It Happen, a practical and compelling book, which I enjoyed for many reasons, but perhaps most of all for some of the more personal anecdotes, which made me look forward to today even more than I already was. So welcome to MarketingKind, Jo. How are you feeling this afternoon?
Hot, but not as bad as it has been. The heat wave, as a Scot, is certainly something I still find a bit challenging. But also, yeah, very, very relaxed. The sunshine, there's blue sky. I always like the light evenings, the light mornings. This time of year is full of joy and things growing, and I was out at the weekend in my garden, which always gives me a lot of joy. Something I didn't get to do much of as a politician, but have certainly enjoyed in my new life.
Well, the heat wave is, of course, related to topics that we may come on to at some point, and I suppose enjoying the garden is a good sign of a proximity to nature and a biophilia that perhaps motivates some of your activity. Now, I thought what we might do to get us started is to look at the trajectory of the past, present, and future of the new economy, but through the lens of your engagement with it, and then sort of expand out from there in terms of what that could mean for all of us. So I don't know about necessarily going right back to the beginning, but maybe we could go back to when you first established a cross-party working group of MPs to work on the new economy. Now, from memory, I think that was 2009. Yep. And my sort of rough perception would be that at that time, on the one hand, new economic thinking was much less substantiated in evidence than it might be today. But on the other hand, maybe the wind was more in its sails and the direction of travel may have felt more exciting in some ways. First of all, is that right? And secondly, how were you defining the new economy then? What led you to creating that group, and what kind of aims were you working towards?
So I think from my earliest time, yeah, in politics, but before politics. I mean, I've always wanted to change the world and been critical about what I think needed to be different. And quite early on in my political career, I was asked to write a chapter for a book, and it was the successor to something called the Orange Book, which was a bit notorious in Lib Dem circles. And the successor one was called Britain After Blair, which dates it. So this was, I think, 2006, or certainly the writing was in 2006. And the chapter that I wrote was on quality of life, the pursuit of happiness. And I chose that because I really felt there was something that was being missed by kind of boiling everything down to economics and the Easterlin paradox, which is probably, I mean, I did go into the kind of theory of it in the chapter, but like that, countries can keep getting richer, but they stop getting happier after a certain level of income. It doesn't necessarily lead to quality of life. So that was a kind of area of inquiry that I thought was really interesting. Perhaps ironically, I was encouraged to write this by one Paul Marshall, who at that point was a Liberal Democrat supporter and has gone on a rather separate journey since then as the founder of GB News. Um, so it was really, that was literally in my second year as an MP that I was exploring this thinking and taking the issue up in Parliament. I remember doing a debate where Angela Eagle answered as the Treasury Minister around alternatives to GDP. And it was with a Labour member of the House of Lords, Richard Layard, that I set up that group on wellbeing economics. And he was very famous for his work, which was very influential with the Blair government on increasing access to psychological therapies, proving that if you spend much more money on giving people mental health interventions, then you can get them off what was then called incapacity benefit, and it saves money overall. And I think that's quite interesting because that element of it, I mean, he would take the view that flourishing was what mattered, but that was the way in which you could kind of make it work within a kind of economic system. But I think there's something there that speaks to the heart of, is it only important to invest in mental health because you can prove that it's good for the economy and the government's overall budget? Or is it good in and of itself to reduce human misery and help people who are struggling with their mental health? And your answer to that question depends on almost what your starting goal is. So, I think the goal should be human flourishing, well-being within ecological limits in a way that is in balance. And I think you're right. At that time, there was quite a lot of momentum. Certainly, the environmental movement, was pretty strong. Had been, particularly around maybe the late 80s, 90s. I remember when I was growing up. I do recall, though, around 2008, that got a lot harder. So the financial crash really had an impact on, how much anything as a kind of alternative idea, the focus was understandably, and, I felt this in my own constituency too, people had that kind of short-term security fears about, were they going to have a job? How are they going to make ends meet? And so the focus was much more on that than kind of more abstract concepts or environmental issues more generally. And so I think there has been kind of a change, and but even then at that time it was incredibly niche. And I was I think it was a couple of years ago I went to the OECD international forum on well-being, or whatever the name was, but it was huge, right? You had finance ministers, you had ministers from lots of countries around the world. They now have like 2/3 of OECD member states are now like measuring well-being and alternatives. And this was like 20 years on from like the initial one that they had. So it has really changed in terms of the take up in the intervening time, even though the kind of narrative for it has kind of ebbed and flowed at various times. I think it's a set of ideas whose time has absolutely come. You're right that we're on the precipice of potentially a very exciting time in UK politics with some change, but that's also a fraught time because there's many voices and forces that do not want things to change because the status quo is working for a small number of people and a small set of interests. And I think this is the conundrum that we're really approaching. But I think it is an exciting time, and overall there is a lot more energy around different thinking about economics than there was then.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned even from back then, Richard Layard's work on mental health, because so we have had the pandemic in the interim, but nevertheless, the number of people out of work because they're affected by mental health issues is such a national crisis at the moment. And I wonder if it relates to not going far enough on well-being. It's hard to find a sort of expert analysis of why we have such a sort of mental health pandemic ruling people out of work at the moment. But some of it must be people having a deep intuitive sense that the world of work is not really working for them. And that brings with it a sort of moral injury, a cognitive dissonance in terms of engaging with something that people feel isn't really on their side for the long term. You had the opportunity, I mean, you've done so many extraordinary things. And so you've had the opportunity to work on wellbeing, not just as an MP, but you had multiple portfolios as government minister. Take us back to where, as a minister, you were able to implement some of this thinking, where you've done so in a way that, you know, maybe you're still proud of and is still impacting us positively today, and where, if anywhere, you might have wished that you could have gone much further.
Yeah. So, I mean, being a minister is a fantastic privilege and opportunity to make change. And it also has some degree of restrictions because you suddenly have a box that you have to stay in. And you're not allowed to speak in Parliament except from the dispatch box. You're not allowed to pronounce. You can't table questions in Parliament. You can't make statements generally on things outside your portfolio area. With some exceptions, but you really are kind of kept within a range. And so in terms of some of the things that I was working on, and I did have a fairly broad portfolio. I mean, it was very expansive, across employment relations and consumer and postal affairs, within Biz Plus, women inequalities, like literally tacked on as an afterthought, like a week after they gave me the first job and they realized that they'd forgotten to appoint a Liberal Democrat equalities minister, which, in terms of a kind of metaphor for where that, general agenda was sitting is quite strong. So I would say the kind of employment relations was probably the area where I was able to pursue the sort of well-being approach the most. And there was some really, interesting, Engage for Success was an initiative that lots of businesses were signed up to that were about how do we engage employees within the workplace. I mean, it's still an ongoing, successful initiative today. Thinking beyond that kind of, command and control management structure, but really, empowering people and letting people thrive within the workplace, obviously making the case that that's good for business and organizations more widely. Also, expanding flexible working and indeed shared parental leave, were things which, definitely moved in the right direction, though in neither case is that like job done. And there's a lot, I'm delighted there's now a real momentum around looking again at paternity leave, which was a battle we couldn't win in the coalition against the Conservatives. But, how do you enable people to merge their kind of work and personal lives? How do they balance all of those different commitments and that flexibility, which of course is much more normal since the pandemic in many jobs, though not in all jobs. We have the tools. It wasn't like we didn't have these tools before, which I think is interesting to kind of bear in mind, but so much of that was cultural, and the law and the kind of ability of government to set an agenda there, I think was quite important. So there's areas like that where I think we made some change, and we did have additional reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, and we helped launch the corporate human rights benchmark. There was some good stuff on the kind of corporate side, but I also feel that there was, if I look back, maybe that's an area where there could have been more, particularly on things like competition policy and the structure of the economy and that concentrations of power, where you see it particularly now with the tech companies. We're like totally unchecked, massive agglomerations of control over so many aspects of our lives can be really negative for well-being in so many ways. And we now only just now are getting to a stage where campaigns on social media and technology's intrusion into our lives, it is gathering real momentum. And I mean, I say this as a parent of 3 children, one of whom is 12, right? Like this is a thing that my friends who are parents of similar age children, this is the worry, right? And of course, what's negative for our children in terms of the kind of mental health impacts of that, that's also about us, right? So we look at it and we can see it in our children, but as so often they're like the mirror that you then realize what's actually happening to yourself, a little bit like when you realize that they get really crabby when they're hungry, and then you suddenly realize that, oh yeah, we probably do that too, don't we? So I think I think there's things which I am proud of achieving in this agenda, but there's also areas where I think if I had my time again, I might go further. Um, and I think the opportunities now are to be even more kind of expansive. I mean, you talked about some of that mental health stuff, and I think it's about like something deeper which is missing for people, right? And some people would talk about it as being belonging, or whether it's the loneliness crisis, which will get talked about in some particular ways. Often it's talked about differently for different ages of people. So loneliness, we kind of almost assume it being something for older people, but actually the same is true for young people too. And and I think part of this is like there's a cost to the economy operating in the way that it does, in that hustle culture, in that kind of always on, in that always prioritizing work. There is a social and a human cost in terms of what we are able to do within our own communities and how we're able to care for one another. Care is not prioritized at all within our economy. It is literally invisible to the economy in the large part because it is something which doesn't have a monetary value attached to it. And so a woman, typically a woman, because of their gender roles in society, is kind of deemed as being more productive when she goes back to work. And I'm all for making sure that people can make their own choices. And, I'm a proud feminist, but like that belittling of the role of care, and even where you do have paid care roles in the economy, they are the most underpaid, undervalued roles. And yet, like, we actually deep down know that these are what matter, because when we had the pandemic and we had the list of essential workers, right, care workers were absolutely on there, along with lots of other workers, refuse collectors, delivery drivers, fruit pickers, like, the people who are actually producing the essentials of life, all of which are undervalued in our current economic system. So I think that there's a very fundamental shift that we do need to get to. And if we were prepared to learn some of the lessons from the pandemic, like, it showed us a lot of that. And yet it feels like as a society, we've kind of like moved on back to how it was, almost perhaps in a slight state of trauma, because it was an incredibly difficult time in lots of ways for so many people. But there were some things within that about slowing down, about realizing that things that seemed unthinkable were not unthinkable. You could go to a situation where hardly any planes flew in the sky. That was totally unthinkable 3 months before, right? You could have a situation where, people were looked after, where homeless people were taken off the streets. All of this stuff, which just felt like this was too big, this was too difficult. Suddenly we could do it if we decided that we wanted to. And so it exposed the choices that we make. And the final thing I would say on that is I think the interdependence. So we kind of assume that everyone's their own little silo, and that's how economics works. The kind of agglomeration of individual choices gets us to the best result. And yet that doesn't account for the interdependence that we have with one another, with public health, which we could see so clearly in the pandemic, but is also there in the ecological disasters that we face. We are absolutely embedded and enmeshed with the natural world, whether it's the heat wave and the way in which a tree will provide us shelter and shade, whether it's the water cycle and the travesty of water companies not investing so that they're putting effluent into our rivers, whether it's about the air that we breathe. Like, we are interdependent with natural systems, and I think we've forgotten so much of that.
Yeah, we certainly have. For people who like to cross-reference from conversation to conversation as we build up a collective picture, in terms of the care economy, people could refer to our exchange on how to put care as the organizing principle for the economy with Tim Johnson. On interdependence, we had a great conversation with Will Hutton, who wrote a book called The We Society. I think that's what it was called. And of course, we had our exchange with Andy Burnham on, you talked about, for me, it's sort of unimaginable to think of the power of a government minister, but actually Andy in our exchange, and I've also heard Sadiq Khan say that among the reasons why they enjoyed becoming mayors were that they could consider problems in the round. And there are so many problems that you can't fix it unless you fix all of it. So actually a segregated approach to government might itself be a problem. Now, when you talked about technology, there was like, I want to bring in your book because I enjoyed reading it so much. There was a statistic in it on the topic of technology, which I don't know if it's accurate for today, but the claim was that 96% of the internet was written by men, which was one of the moments that shocked even me as I was reading it. Now, I think
Probably
it
more now.
was published, well, certainly by volume, even if the percentage was slightly more favorable, just the sheer amount. But it was published, I think, 8 years ago. And when I read it today, I would like to think it's on gender inequalities for anyone who hasn't read it yet. I'd like to think that much of it comes across as just straightforward, practical common sense rather than anything controversial. And yet, if I think, if I imagine you going back to frontline politics today and picture what your social media feed might look like, even in comparison to a few years ago, just in the last 24 hours, we've had Trump trolling Georgia Maloney and claiming on social media that there should be a restraining order against her. And we really don't have to look far to find evidence of very small concentrations of very powerful men ruining it for many millions of women and actually for most men as well. If you were writing the book today, how would your tone be different? How would you update it? Would you write it differently? What's your take on it 8 years after publication?
Mm. Really, really interesting question. And I mean, I see that book as also maybe my route into understanding systems, right? And it kind of it almost sounds like really strange to say, but I feel like I I was Minister for Women and Equalities, as I say, alongside all my responsibilities in the minister as a Minister for Business. And by the way, when you talk about things being siloed, I found that probably the areas where they overlapped was where I was able to do more. So we did a lot on the Women on Boards agenda. The flexible working and shared parental leave was in my role as Minister for Employment Relations, but of course had massive equality kind of elements. And I think so I totally like endorse that point that greater kind of cohesion between those different, less siloed thinking within government is really important. I mean, undoubtedly, there's a lot of elements that have got worse on gender equality. There's lots of things that have, continued to get better. I mean, if you look at women on boards on a non-exec basis, I mean, it's transformed compared to where it was. On an executive role basis, in terms of chief execs and chief finance officers, it's still tiny. And so some of the problems that are kind of like easier or quicker to fix we've sometimes made progress where we've put a focus. But I think what I was trying to explain was just how deeply connected it all was, which I don't think I even realized, when I went into that role. And it really kind of became clear to me because you sort of see these problems politically, at least in a silo. Like, here's a problem with women's pensions and women's finance over there, and here's a problem with violence against women over here. And look, here's about, what the advertising images of women are and the kind of norms about pressures to be incredibly thin and look at in a particular way. And today that would be about having the perfect 101 step skincare regime. Those kind of things are seen separately and they're often dealt with separately. And yet it was like, and I mean, obviously lots of feminists have like written this before. I was not the first person to see this, but the experience of me seeing that just made me want to share it, from having had that vantage point in politics, that these things are all connected, that it is a system. It is a system that is created, that socializes gender from a really early age, that sets expectations for little girls and indeed for little boys. And a point that I made in the book is that this kind of gender norm patriarchal society, in some ways is ostensibly good for men, but actually doesn't do men any favors because it sets them in the same kind of straitjacket of the roles that they're unable to fulfill. And that's why I think the campaigns like Dad Shift are so important for actually, or the work that Richard Reeves has done on kind of like looking at men and boys and the role of that within society. How do we create a different kind of vision, different role models? And I say this as the mom of three boys, who are the people that I want them to look up to, beyond their parents, and knowing that children all go through an age where parents are not going to be the ones that they look up to at any event. So who are the people that they should kind of see as role models? And so I think that manosphere, that kind of online hate, violence has become so much more normalized. The prevalence of kind of access to porn and kind of extreme violence, when you look at the statistics, is just kind of quite horrific compared to even what it was a decade ago. Those pressures that, those body image pressures that girls were feeling very intensely have continued and intensified. And then you've got the whole kind of looks maxing for boys, which was starting at that point, but is now much more significant. So I think it's still relevant, but has obviously, continued. But I think in tone, the thing that I would keep the same is that this is all a choice. This is, and this is not a choice of some kind of group of people locked in a room that have decided this is how it's going to be. This is a collective set of cultural norms that are created by all of us. And the first thing is to try to see them. And the second thing is to see what are the things that we can do to try to unpick them or to change them. And we can do that, and everybody can do that. And of course, a government minister or a mayor of a city, or a chief executive has particular power, but everybody has some power. You have power in the relationships that you have, in the in the way in which you live your life. I mean, as I say in the book, as simple as literally going out and running in the street if you're a woman, and for girls to see women with sweat without makeup on, and again, that's still something which has been seen as quite kind of shocking or against the norm. I remember the furore when Julia Roberts was pictured, on a red carpet dress, and she hadn't shaved her underarm hair, right? And we're still in that kind of world, right? So from the really small things, like the encouraging conversation you have with a young girl or a young boy about what they might want to do, and trying to like expand beyond gender norms, to are you leading an organization that can fundamentally change the way it does things and make sure it's got an equal maternity and paternity policy? Or as men, the conversations that you have with your mates about violence against women and banter and where the lines are. Everybody's got stuff they can do. And so I really want people to feel that they have agency. It's not to say it's all their fault, but that you can do something about it, rather than, oh, this problem is just too difficult, too big, I'll put it in that box, I can't possibly do anything about it. We can all do something. And if everybody did something, then we would be making progress.
Well, certainly it's a very approachable book, and it has the kind of advice that you can implement on a day-to-day basis. So most of it is just kind of a very friendly read. I will actually admit, because you talked about violence against women, in the chapter on violence against women, this is the only time it's ever happened to me in my whole life. But there is one page of your book that I haven't read because it was too difficult to read. It's quite difficult to even. I'm going to have to just park it for a minute to be able to continue to speak. So
yeah,
some very powerful evidence in there, as well as some very friendly day-to-day advice. Now, there's also a chapter for men on why this is a win-win. And I want to pick up on that because I talked at the start about positive sum thinking versus zero sum thinking. For me, it feels relatively intuitive to take these issues in a positive sum way, because I think even on a selfish basis, if I think about diversity and inclusion, if my experience was more diverse, would that enrich life or impoverish it? It would probably make it better. If I can include more parts of myself in terms of what I take, in terms of what I enjoy on a day-to-day basis, then again, that makes life better. And if across society, both of those things increase, then that creates a better society to live in. So it feels like a very positive sum set of arguments. But it feels like making the positive sum case for anything is getting much more difficult these days. What do you think is most fundamentally responsible for that, and how might we turn that around if you share that perception?
So I think we do live in a much more fragmented and fractured and fractious society. I mean, it's fashionable to kind of say it's all the fault of social media. It's not all the fault of social media, but undoubtedly, like, the algorithms do lead people to extremes, and that has an impact. And you can see that we've had, I mean, in the UK, we've had like 2 big divisive referendums. I mean, the I suppose one of them was perhaps not experienced in England and Wales and Northern Ireland in quite the same way, but the referendum about keeping the UK together or Scotland going independent, was very polarizing within Scotland, and to this day, 12 years on, has an impact on family groups and friendships, and also the Brexit referendum. So there's a lot of different kind of factors. I think part of it is also, the kind of the economic pressure that people are facing as well, right? So if you think of what are some of the antidotes to the that kind of division within society, there's some interesting research from France that shows, for example, when local pubs closed in villages, the support for the far right went up. And so it's like, what spaces are there? And in those French villages, it would have been perhaps the local pub. But I think for that, you could also read community centres, libraries, like that kind of infrastructure of the community. And that's both a function of, does it exist? Is there actually a place where people can go? And then also, like, do people actually have the capacity and the time? And if you're working 2 jobs to just make ends meet, with extra shifts at night, you don't necessarily have the ability to, engage in the same way. And in many cases, and hands up, totally recognise the role that the austerity of the government in the 2010s had on that, but has also continued and got worse. And so there's a kind of unpicking of local space, of civic space, and then you combine that with the kind of online civic space replacing a lot of those spaces, and that being much less inclusive. So I often feel as a parent at the school gates, that is a pretty inclusive space. Obviously it's fairly geographically defined, so in that sense, it's not including people from all corners of the country, but it is all walks of life, because everybody, look, like all communities, all types of people have kids, maybe not in an age profile, but you get a kind of exchange, you have a connection with people in the same way that you would in a kind of local space that people were using, and in the way that online spaces do not operate like that, which can be amazing. If you have a rare disease or a niche hobby and you're able to like connect with people who get you and understand you and you can share and support, like, that's wonderful. But if all of your life is kind of increasingly led with people who are like very, very similar to you, then you've lost something about that kind of different perspectives. And even like picking up a newspaper, even if it had a particular agenda, it has that columnist that they have to kind of provoke that you disagree with. And, you actually scan the page and see different things rather than just being given, the articles that, the algorithm thinks that you're going to be most interested in. So I think there is that kind of reduction of physical space where we meet difference. And so like what you would do, and I think some of the antidote is how do you enable people to be with each other more, like in real life, in person, in community with one another. And it might be through, sports or activities or shared hobbies, or, there's it can be all sorts of different ways. But again, if your economic system is making that harder, then it reduces that potential. So I actually think that is one of the actions that we can all take. I mean, I saw somebody recently saying the most political thing they'd done all year was regularly host people around for dinner, and it wasn't a complicated dinner. It was just having some food, and they started with people they knew really well. They went to acquaintances, but they just had conversations, and that's a kind of radical act. And if you read the Timothy Snyder book on tyranny, which I totally recommend if you haven't read it, and it's a short book, 20 lessons from the 20th century, but it talks about how the way in which we engage in our local place is so important, those relationships. And I think that kind of reality and, where things really are lived and experienced, and where you can form a bond with another human being and you don't need to agree on the politics and you don't need to agree on the ideology. I think there's a real power in that.
Yeah, it makes me think that there is a discrepancy between the algorithms of evolution and the algorithms of human development on the one hand, and then the tech algorithms. I guess human development, as we conceive of it, has been with us for a tiny fraction of evolution, but the tech algorithms have been with us for a tiny fraction of human development. And so I think that you're right, that there are many discrepancies between those, which may have some attraction to them in some ways, but actually, bring a lot of risks with them as well. let's move along the journey that you've achieved so much that we have to fast forward some things. Um, but I can't imagine having been a frontline politician and the opportunities available to you. But I sort of have a sense that as you move on from frontline politics, on the one hand, there's almost any number of organizations that in theory you could make a big contribution to and be well placed to lead. But on the other hand, there's not necessarily any one thing in specific where the fit is obviously the perfect. How did you come to take the helm at Partners for a New Economy, and what was your own framing when you took on the role in terms of how you conceived of the challenge that you were taking on?
Sure. I'll come to that in just a second, but I just had to respond on that point about the tech algorithms and human evolution and tech evolution, because I also think nature is a really interesting teacher, right? And nature does diversity. Nature thrives in diversity. And when you have monoculture, things die, right? And I think that I sometimes think there's a real arrogance, in some corners where, we kind of like the point where we think we are better than nature or that we can control it and like we're in charge, like we are not, right? Like anyone who's been out at sea, will understand or, experience that heat wave or, fire, like, nature kind of does its thing and we should be working with it. And I think that diversity is one of the great things that we can learn from nature and the way in which it experiments as well. Partners for Your Economy, I mean, as I say, I've been interested in wellbeing economics like way back, since 2006 at least. And I'd had a period where I was out of frontline politics between 2015 and 2017, where I was experimenting with what I would do that wasn't politics before Theresa May called the snap election. And I was clear I wanted to go back. And I'd done some consulting. That was when I wrote my book, which I really enjoyed. There was also a love-hate relationship because, writing's quite a challenging, solitary thing to do. And I really did learn from that experience that I needed to be making positive change. I'm effectively a campaigner at heart. And I kind of wanted a challenge that was kind of significant, that was big. And so in 2019, when I lost, that was obviously hard. Like, losing your seat is a difficult thing to do, as anyone who's experienced redundancy will know. I also knew, like there was an element of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Having done it once, like I kind of knew I would find, another outlet. And I was determined that it had to be very mission related. So I started getting in touch with lots of people that I'd previously, known or worked with, and, trying to have those conversations about what it might be. And I remember a conversation in particular with Catherine Trebek, who she had been working at Oxfam on the Humankind Index back in I don't know, 2008-9, and I was one of the politicians on her advisory board for that, on kind of alternative ways of measuring progress. And we had this cup of coffee in an Italian in Glasgow, and she was telling me about this new thing. She was working at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and I was like, well, that sounds great, like wow. Where are you, how are you being funded? And she said, well, there's this organization, Partners for a New Economy. So I went online, looked it up, and I thought, well, that's really interesting. That didn't exist before. It had been founded a few years earlier. And I thought, well, maybe I'll end up doing some kind of non-exec kind of pro bono thing within this field, and find a full-time role elsewhere. And then literally 2 months later, the role as director of Partners for New Economy was advertised, and by then we were full into the pandemic. And I was like so clear that when I looked at that job description that, it was like, can you manage difficult stakeholders? And I'm like, yeah, I've managed the Liberal Democrats, so and obviously the whole mission, was very attractive. So I didn't apply for other jobs. I mean, I was also like parenting two kids and homeschooling and, all of that chaos at the time. I rang everybody that I knew on Zoom, obviously, that would have some connection to it. So Tim Jackson was on my list because, I'd done stuff alongside him previously. Stuart Wallace, who used to be at the New Economics Foundation. I basically just spoke to everybody I could to kind of be able to do the best possible application, and was really delighted to get the job. And I'd never done grant making before. I was pretty new to philanthropy, which is a whole new world to navigate. But that kind of mission and the idea of being able to try to identify what are the things to create the conditions for these new ideas to come into being. I mean, it's so intellectually stimulating as a thing to be spending your time doing. And compared to politics, to be able to have that future focus and not be constrained by, what would this look like on the front page of the Daily Mail tomorrow? Can you do the Today programme interview on this right now and have the answer to every question? Like, no, we don't have the answer to every single question. Okay, so what are the questions that we need to answer? What research or campaigning or kind of experiments could we be funding that would help us to get to some of those answers? So yeah, I mean, I do wake up every day and I do feel incredibly lucky to be able to be doing this work with a great group of funders, a great small staff team, a fantastic board, and a whole field. I mean, we did some mapping work last year with Metabolic, a Dutch think tank, on the new economy field across Europe, and they found 735 organisations right across the continent doing amazing stuff. Half of whom had been founded in the last decade. So this is an idea that's got momentum, there's energy, that there's more and more people turning to this as they look at the current world and they go, there's something not working here. Like, people know there is something that's not right. I mean, that's not as easy as saying, okay, well, this is the prescription to sort it all out, right? That bit is hard, but people get that it's wrong and it's not working.
Yeah, there's so much I want to pick up on in everything that you say, really. A couple of smaller things when you talk about love-hate with writing a book. I've written a couple of books challenging dimensions of conventional economic thinking, proposing an alternative to the default strategy of competitive advantage for business, and another one on purpose. And I take my writing seriously, so I put a lot of thought into them. But it also, as a result, I've described it as feeling like pulling barbed wire slowly through my brain. So I can relate to that. And you also talked about some of the bruisingness of politics. And from what I remember, probably some of your more difficult experiences came from wanting to reverse Brexit, which, with hindsight, I mean, we may say there were others who were even worse, but certainly the evidence is all on your side in that one. So it must be frustrating when the toughest experiences you have are when, according to the evidence, you're right. I want to pick up on the framing of how do we make the new economy just the economy? Because you talked about the value of diversity in nature, and I'm with you and I'm totally on your side with that. But there is a sort of power to the opposite view in terms of simplicity. So I remember listening to a very famous advertising executive who admitted that he wasn't a creative, he was an accountant. He said, and his phrase was, I may be a bean counter, but I prefer counting more beans than less beans. And everybody instantly knew what he wanted. And there is something simple and straightforward about conventional economics. And if we think about the new economy, you talked about the study and all the diverse organizations working on so many aspects of its thinking. Is that diversity a strength or a weakness? How do we actually make that new economy not just a collection of attractive ideas, but a thing that becomes mainstream?
Well, it's both. Diversity is a strength and a weakness, and I think probably one of the most important words in this work, because it's full of tensions and almost what appear to be contradictions, but I think it's an and, right? It's yes and. Yes, we need short-term quick wins so that people can feel it, and we need to be thinking about the long term. Yes, we need stuff to be at a global level so that it's systemic change, and we need stuff to be really hitting at the local level where people can feel it and it's real. So yes, and is really important. Sorry, repeat the question for me, because I've lost the thread there.
Actually, turn the new economy into a thing that becomes mainstream, because it's so easy to identify and work around, even if it's wrong. Anybody can more profit, anyone can want to grow GDP. It's simple and it's clear, and it appears to be an obvious good. Now, the new economy, the ideas are flourishing. There are so many organizations, Europe, but how do we actually get a handle on it and make it the mainstream?
Yeah. So I do agree that simplicity is important, particularly for communication. I mean, it's one of the reasons I like donut economics, because you have that simplicity. This one diagram shows you want the social foundations, nobody falling through the hole, and you do it within the limits of what the planet can sustain. And the goal of the economy is to land in that donut, and people can start to understand it. Obviously, then how you do it, it is more complicated, but people are also used to like, you know, not just optimizing for one variable. I mean, Tim Jackson talks about how you don't go to the doctor and you just ask what your heart rate is and then like walk out the door and think that's fine because, everything else just depends on your heart rate. So I think it needs to be manageable. And the United Nations has just done a big piece of work to try to say, well, what would alternatives beyond GDP look like? There are examples where you have like 85 different indicators. I think the Scottish government's performance framework is something like that. That's clearly too many for people to understand. But, you can have more than one thing. People do care about more than one thing at once, right? They can be concerned about the mortgage rate and also what the unemployment rate is, like how likely they are to have a job, and also whether or not, if their dog goes in the local river, that they're actually going to come out covered in poo, right? So I think you can try to make some of it simple, and it is basically about people living good lives, right, without and being able to continue doing that for future generations. At one level it's not really difficult, particularly when the current system isn't delivering. I think worth remembering that the current system feels unassailable, but it too was many decades in the making, right? The Mont Pelerin Society that helped to usher in neoliberalism, they first met in the late 1940s, right? And you wouldn't say that neoliberalism properly took hold until that Thatcher-Reagan axis in the early 1980s. So kind of changing ideas does work on a slightly different time frame, and it doesn't happen all in one go, but there are moments when you see big changes. And I think that is one of the things that it always seems impossible until it's done. I think that was a Mandela quote, and then suddenly it's done, and then you think, oh well, and there's been so many occasions in the past where we banned sending children up chimneys, right? I mean, that was just normal, right? Like slavery still exists in many forms, but officially, like sanctioned, that is not a thing that we have anymore. But whole economies depended on it. I mean, that would have felt like an absolute mammoth thing to try to change. So there are occasions where we can be really inspired by big changes that have happened through history. The very, universal suffrage, right? Is another example. So yeah, you can get to change. You do want to make it as simple as possible, and but at heart, like, what people want isn't that complex, right? And it's just making clear that the current economy isn't delivering it. And actually, that's a truth that many people also realize is the case. And then there's a fight going on for, well, why is that? And what's the alternative? And there's plenty of people who are peddling scaremongering stories to say that your life isn't good, not because of the economy, not because of extractive practices, but because of the people down the road with brown skin, or people who are on a small boat. And those narratives are very simplistic. And they are told in a way, as a marketing audience, told in a way that is very emotionally resonant. And that's why also new stories are part of what we need, right? New kind of cultural identities, new ways of kind of having meaning. And I think, as somebody, it feels a bit weird to say this, I'm not particularly religious, or I'm not religious, I don't believe in God, but I think there is an interesting role for spirituality. I had a great conversation recently with an organization called the Economy of Francesco, which was kind of set up following a call by the previous pope to kind of center what Francis of Assisi had thought about the economy. I think there is, talking about the belonging dimension that's kind of missing. I think there are stories and kind of cultural references that are from beyond the kind of current economics that are also relevant here and which do resonate with people.
On the topic of an idea whose time has come, something that's cropped up with some of the guests we've had previously is a concern over whether they actually have the right ideas, but the time for them came and went, and we didn't deploy them. and that in some ways it's too late for the optimal trajectory of those ideas. I mean, today, I mean, one of the reasons that Keir Starmer eventually had to stand down was the resignation of a defence secretary. And the resignation came because of a difficulty being able to fund defence needs, and funding defence requires borrowing on less unfavourable terms at a time when public services are really stretched and hollowed out and not meeting people's expectations. And some of our guests have advocated for mitigation approaches on climate and so on, and whole ranges of ideas that it feels those ideas could have been much more smoothly implemented a number of years ago. And today, if we think of Andy maybe taking over in a couple of weeks, when you have to fund defence, when you have to fund public expenditure, those things depend on a market perception of your activity to negotiate borrowing terms. So does the new economy, is there a robust enough evidence base that actually works in the round and that can give states, the UK, other states across Europe, plans that work actually in the whole and that can really turn around what are some significant challenges? I mean, I know you don't shy away from this because the theme of your last annual conference, for anyone who wasn't there, including me, was, I think, hope in a time of collapse or something like that. So is the evidence base actually strong enough to work today, given how late we've left it?
Yes, right. I mean, like, we have a lot of the tools for what we need to do. I think it was Jean-Claude Juncker who said, the problem is not knowing what to do. The problem is getting elected, again, once you've done it. And I think, there's a kind of truth in that, right? So this is not a problem of, is it possible? This is a kind of a problem of political will. And that links into a lot of the things we discussed earlier about a very fractious, divided society, where there is not necessarily, consensus. And it is about, like, a real sense of mission. I mean, you mentioned defense, right? I mean, the world is a much more dangerous place than it was, when I was growing up I was born in 1980. So yes, okay, in the 1980s, there was a lot of, the Cold War was pretty bad, but I probably don't remember that. I remember the Berlin Wall coming down on Going Live with, like, Philip Schofield, like, having a competition to, like, win a piece of it. So that peace dividend, right, like, to many people, like, has been invisible because they don't necessarily recall a time without it, but it has been there. And so, I mean, there's still very many questions to have about how do we best defend ourselves? What are the threats? And I think we have these multiple threats. So we had, the intelligence report about the threats to food systems and the national security risks of biodiversity loss, right? So, we absolutely need to be aware of the massive threats, and increasing threats from, say, Russia and so on in this world, or indeed the unreliability of the US when so much of our security has previously depended on the US, and that really changes that kind of, geoeconomic, geostrategic, focus. Particularly problematic, I would say, now that we've come out of the European Union, given where our kind of values and our closest strategic allies are. But I mean, to give Keir Starmer credit, he did take some significant steps towards repairing some of those relationships. So I mean, it is a very difficult world, but we can still feed people and provide the essentials and aim towards having security. We can't control what every other country in the world is going to do, and whether you're going to have leaders who act in the ways that we've seen. But it's totally feasible, but it probably isn't feasible with the same levels of extraction that are going on. And in some ways, we're also addicted to those levels of extraction, like even the way in which our pensions are kind of dependent on it, because that's the way we've chosen to structure that. But there are other ways to choose to support people, throughout their lives. So I think we just need to get out of this box of thinking this is the only way it can be. And that's what I mean about the lessons from the pandemic. Like, sometimes you have to sort of start from a bit of a blank sheet of paper and say, how are we going to deal with this? The pandemic was a good example. Obviously, wartime has been another good example when you faced really significant threats. And that's, the world today is dangerous on multiple levels. But we can we can have some agency in that. And I think that's also about the role of government, right? So we've kind of got used to a kind of view, particularly in places like America, of saying that, actually everything just gets provided by the market and global trade, and really small state, what is the role of states? Well, actually, it turns out, you want to combat these threats, you need to have some kind of democratic accountability and structures that are operating at the national level, sometimes at the international level, and often, at the city or more local level as well. But we can have some agency about it, right? It's not all being done to us, and we can choose to do it differently.
You remind me a little of something Polly Mackenzie told us, and actually this relates somewhat to Will Hutton as well, in terms of, the American model of everything is provided by the markets, and if that causes a problem, then those businesses have paid some tax, and so you can solve that problem. It's sort of, I guess, been our model as well. And the issue arises when the bills are just going up so that they are too much for taxes to pay for. And so you need a different relationship where businesses are creating social benefits rather than harms, and that reduces the bills and so on. And that works very well with a high level of cooperation and trust across society. But actually, if we think about government getting closer to business today, on the one hand, businesses fear that government will queer the pitch. And so a lot of businesses don't want more government in their life, they want less. And equally, when we think about, as a member of the public, if I hear about a big business getting involved in a government scheme, I think, well, there's going to be a lot of lobbying and vested interest here, rather than a sort of multi-stakeholder gathering of what is in the national interest. So how do we elevate that kind of trust? And is there any modeling among the initiatives that you fund that looks at, what are the key tipping points or milestones or purchase points that can enable you to actually chunk up a delivery of the new economy in practice?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it's a really fundamental point about the role of business, the private sector. And I think we do need to get away from the idea that, business does its business and then pays some tax. Professor Colin Mayer has some really interesting stuff about, the purpose of business is to solve problems profitably, right? So you're solving problems of society, and it could be all sorts of different problems, and it could be about wants as well as about needs. But, if you're not in the business of solving problems, then, you shouldn't be in business. And I think at a basic level, I mean, part of this is a very interconnected economy, very large scale, which makes it harder to kind of, unpick it. But, if you are making a profit in business, that ought to be as a result of having created a net benefit for society, right? If you have created a net disbenefit, then really you don't have much business making a profit from that, right? So if that is the case that you can, I mean, there's one argument that says, well, you just have, regulation, and there's obviously a really important role for regulation, right? We have, safety standards on, everything from clothing to toys to, fire requirements. We have, rules about not being able to pay people, an absolute pittance. Although, I think there's a genuine question to ask, if you are a big business making significant profits, paying dividends, paying, high levels to your senior team, and you pay, your frontline staff at a level that the state has to top up what they earn in order for them to be able to live and make ends meet, then how does that compute really? Why should your, investors be getting, money back when the state is having to subsidize? It's a different case for a small business, right? But for, for large businesses, well, why is that the case? And if you are causing loads of environmental harm, right? So I think at its heart, is our economy driving value? Is it creating value or destroying value? And we don't even have all the information to know the answer to that question. But if it is destroying value, which, I think it is, and I think we kind of feel that, whether that's social value in terms of the precarity, and we just don't count that. These are externalities. But if everyone's been shifted to uncertain, contracts where they don't have any security, and, the cleanup bill environmentally has been pushed onto the state, that's perhaps why it's become unsustainable, right? There's a limit to what to what the state can do. So the solution has to be that we work together. And the missions approach, I mean, I saw Mariana Mazzucato this morning, like she's done some amazing stuff working with individual governments, helping them to work productively in partnerships with, parts of their economies, have sectoral strategies, like actually use procurement much more intelligently, to use government money to really kind of like drive positive change, to try to create the economy and make it like a value creating engine rather than like masking extraction and then wondering why people are unhappy.
Glad you mentioned small businesses, because government typically more easily engages with big businesses because it solves a bigger problem at once. But actually, it's often smaller businesses that can make a disproportionate contribution relative to their size because their governance enables them to be as positive as their owners wish them to be. And so there's an overlooked potential sometimes there. So I think we've got a couple of questions. So I think it was Neil and then Mark.
Hi, Jo. I'm privileged. Thank you so much. It's fascinating to hear everything you've had to say. Have a kind of bold and big idea question. Almost inspired actually. I learned when I was looking up economy, I didn't realize it was from a Greek word meaning household management, which is a kind of thing. Well, actually, sometimes we think economy is so big, but actually it's household management. It kind of brings it down to size. As you've been a politician, the things that could change are kind of like if we were to look at kind of like ultra processed foods, if we were to get rid of those, was it 90% of rare diseases, Chris Van Tulleken says, would disappear. But that's a very difficult thing to ask to Unilever. If we, because, we go to a school, what's outside the school gate? Monster and vapes. How, how are we allowing that? Then if we look at kind of energy things, so it's kind of like we could stabilize energy prices, we could protect, but if we chose to. Similarly with healthcare, we could make it freer at a point of action, but it's a big decision. And then also the wellness thing. I had the privilege to be at a talk last week where Zach Cass, who used to work at OpenAI, was doing a keynote, and he said that the whole wellness piece really, really hit when they launched the smartphone. And that was such a massive spike in the well-being thing towards a negative and depression and anxiety. Big idea. Say to kind of like the tech companies, say the ones selling the smartphone, saying, look, we've got a wellness problem, we've got an anxiety problem. You're the cause. So if you want to pick up the tab, that's fine. We can have your products. But how I know those kind of ideas are really uncomfortable, but what are the challenges of doing things that holistic within politics, and would it ever be possible?
So, I mean, great questions. And I think it depends, some are more doable than others, right? So on energy, for example, I think there's a really strong argument to have a different kind of tariff. At the moment, we charge everybody a certain amount before they even use any energy. And then if you use lots, you pay less per unit used, right? Which is like totally the wrong way around. Whereas you could have a situation where you give everybody a certain amount, a kind of basic amount, which is either free, you could make it free if you chose to, depending on your price structure, or, heavily discounted to make sure that people had the essentials. And then, the more you use, the more you pay. And so people who are profligate with energy, and you'd have to have some, qualifiers in there for people who had a kidney dialysis machine or particular health reasons and so on, but you could design that, right? And that could be quite popular, right? You could see how you could sell that. Whereas the thing about ultra high processed foods, you suddenly are like, well, you can understand the political opposition, right? So we got the sugar tax in, that like huge lobbying, right? So that, the money in politics and the money in kind of lobbying is a big part of this, right? And there's currently legislation in Westminster about trying to cap money on political donations, which we should do. We should get money as far as possible out of politics, big money out of politics. But ultimately it's whether it's popular. And I mean, I think the tech company is a really interesting one, because for such a long time it was really popular because people were getting their Facebook and whatever for free. And things like the smartphone free childhood campaign have been brilliant, right? And the people who have done the narratives and the adverts about, I don't know if you've seen that video shop one that they did, the 1990s video shop. If you haven't seen it, go and look it up. Really bringing home to people tapping in through networks of largely parents who are concerned and creating a real political momentum that suddenly had to be answered, right? And so you can do it, but it's like people power, and you need a big, broad base of power and demand to take on big interests. But I think that can be possible, but you're not going to do it just with an evidence base on its own. And I think that's sometimes the mistake that people make. They think, well, you make the case and then the government minister can just make the decision. And even if you got a government minister to make that decision, it would be incredibly vulnerable if you didn't have the broad-based support for that, because then you just it gets undone, a few years later. So actually, this is the kind of work of campaigning and building support over time. But yeah, I mean, I think you can have that, and I think vapes is interesting as well, right? Like, what's the argument for anybody vaping, like, who wasn't previously a smoker? Like, is there any reason why that's desirable in our society? Like, totally, compared to smoking cigarettes, like, there is a very strong case. I used to be on an advisory committee for the Advertising Standards Authority, and we had this very discussion about, like, what should the kind of regime be from, in that case, an advertising perspective, and whether you made any kind of like medical claims. But it feels like, again, like unchecked, right, without the kind of regulation put on it, like the market just extracts, right? If it can make money, it does. And it's not to say the market's always bad and there aren't good businesses, but you can't expect that model to act in people's best interests when it literally isn't set up to have people's best interests at heart. So that is where the role of government is incredibly important and has to be defended and has to be demanded as well.
Thanks. Hi, Jo. Again, echoing everyone here, fascinating listening to your thoughts on all of those different subjects. I think one of the key things that we've lost track of, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on, I think there's a big dichotomy, a difference between the perceived strength and value of our economy on the world stage, saying how such a wealthy country we are. Yet again, in people's day-to-day lives, that doesn't seem to correlate with the fact that many people are unable to either get on the housing ladder, be able to comfortably manage their standard of living, be it utilities, food, leisure. Those of us that were around in the 90s can remember a time where people could afford houses, go on holidays, hop over to France a few times a year on a day trip, and it could all be afforded. And I heard a quote by someone over the past week saying, "I'm earning more money than I've ever earned, but I feel poorer. I can afford so much less." And I think often what governments, having led communication teams and departments in central government and local government, I think one of the failings that, especially with the politicians, is that they don't want to spell out the big holistic picture to the electorate and public. They get too tied up in the nitty-gritty and the tactics and the debates around points of issue. I think what I'm going to propose to you is that, what do you think are the main tenets that we need to put forward as an integrated, almost like transformation project, to say, how do we rectify this, as a country, to say, how do we tackle all these sorts of these paradigms or these dichotomies, and then put that into a coherent sort of simple to understand plan that we can all then get round and work towards, irrespective of where you sit on the political spectrum. So based more on societal and human and community values. I mean, this sort of ties back into the subject of today's conversation. And I'd like to know what key tenets you would think that we need to really put up there for people to start piecing this, as it were, action plan together.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I'd just say is that kind of disconnect or dissonance that you describe between the apparent strength and value of our economy and people's experiences, that's partly a distributional problem, right? So you can say we're, whatever, biggest economy in the world, but we're also a very unequal society. And there was research I was reading recently that if you look at the median person, like the quality of life here is like, like similar to Slovenia, I think, right? So it's like we kind of have this idea, but that's partly because you've got this kind of inflated, like, City of London, very kind of, bubble bit at the top. And that's, I think, also why GDP is such a poor measure on its own, because it tells you nothing about who has what, right? And so we're also, I think, why Andy Burnham's kind of priority on good growth is important, rather than just saying growth is the answer in itself. Like, actually, what prosperity do we want? Like, how is it being created? If you just take the shackles off the City of London, like the idea that that's somehow going to magically make people's lives better in Darlington or Swansea, like, it doesn't make sense. So you need to think about the actual economy. And then also there are some big things like the Iran stuff, right? The Strait of Hormuz, like that makes us all poorer. And that doesn't like explicitly get said necessarily, like the financial crisis did, like ultimately COVID did. Like these shocks, have an impact, and that isn't really nice to talk about, but that is the reality. In terms of what to do, I mean, I think missions is the right approach. I mean, I just didn't agree with how Keir Starmer did it. Like, he made growth the mission, but as I say, you could do that in lots of ways that would not be helpful, and growth isn't really the end goal. Or even like the NHS, I mean, we do need an NHS that works, but the goal is actually that people have healthy lives, and so you want to think about it holistically, and that might have an impact on your transport policy or food policy, to take the point that Neil just mentioned. So I think, like, having some missions, kind of having a way to measure the right stuff and have accountability for it, so it's not just, say, on growth, but then also the participation, because that's the other bit that's been missing, right? Like, how do people help to shape what that looks like? And maybe there's an opportunity now with this 10-year plan that Andy Burnham is going to set out, much more decentralization of power, so that people can be engaged in what happens locally, which is where, their local high street, what happens to that bit of green space, the stuff that affects them on a day-to-day basis, rather than people having a feeling that things are being done to them, whether it's by like a government that's far away, or it's by massive, tech oligarchs making decisions, and, presidents of other countries deciding stuff, and they don't really feel like they have any kind of levers to control it. How do we turn that back and enable people to be involved in shaping what they want? And that's how democracy should work. It's not how it's been working well enough in recent years, but I think some missions that people can get behind that are informed by that conversation with people, so that they have some input, and then you get the companies and others behind it. Like a bit in the pandemic, again, we did this, right? We said we need a vaccine, right? It was a very clear mission, but government didn't do it on its own, right? Government worked with the private sector, with amazing scientists. Obviously there were lots of problems in terms of procurement of PPE and so on, and rightly being explored, but there were amazing things that lots of businesses did to kind of get on with helping people, supporting their workforce, supporting communities, like, because we had a clear collective mission. And I think that government has a role in that kind of organizing and coordinating position that it can play, but it needs to have the participation. It needs to be actually engaged with what people are looking for, if it's to have any legitimacy, and if for people to feel that they have control over their lives.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think too is that, just as you say, if you have a mission and it's clearly stated, people will gather around it and bring resource and thinking and enthusiasm to it. So I think that there's, I know I've dealt with other things in the past where we've had strategic pillars or remits, but that's a little bit dry and management speak. You just want to humanize it and for people to relate to it, both at an individual level, but also see the macro benefit to society, and the nation. So so thanks for that.
No problem.
Participation is a powerful note and a galvanizing note maybe to conclude on. With the government missions, there hasn't been a website anywhere where you can sort of look at it and see, well, where are we up to in achieving that mission? What can we contribute to achieving it? And then how does society orientate its rewards around those contributions? And perhaps a revised approach. There was something similar to that actually for the Greater Manchester region. So maybe you are announcing something that at least we could potentially look forward to. As we're sort of closing time-wise, I just want to make a couple of announcements. So our next gathering will be our next Your MarketingKind with one of our founding members, Peter Seymour, who was former VP of Marketing and Strategy for Europe at Mondelez. And this is relevant to today because it is on how marketing can save us from political extremes on July 15th. And our next exchange will be with Kate Pickett, who people will know as was the best-selling author of The Spirit Level. And we'll be discussing her latest work on the good society and how we make it on September 9th. And I am confident that we'll pick up on today's conversation in that. And Jo, thinking of that last conference, Hope in a Time of Collapse, at MarketingKind, we've tried to balance a realistic appraisal of the challenges we face with nevertheless wanting to preserve the capacity for hopeful action, both to make a difference and for our own well-being. And I'm sure we and everyone who listens to the recording will be so grateful for your energy, your positivity, and the sense of agency that you embody with everything that you've done, in giving us that, increasing the sense of agency that we might feel in tackling some of these problems in our own spheres of action and influence to the degree that we can. So I think the best way we can repay that generosity is just by doing our best to put that energy into action. So thank you so much. And I hope this isn't the last time that we get to have a conversation with you.
Absolutely, Paul. And I will just give you one of my favorite quotes, which is, "Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up."
Wonderful. Who is that from?
I heard the president of Iceland saying it, but I'm not sure if it originated with her. But yeah, Halla Thomasdottir said it.
Well, I've heard Jo Swinson say it. And I think I'm going to attribute that from here on in.
Fantastic. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for inviting me.